Hey, everybody. Cool. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to talk about how Neo's onboarding technology and framework has improved and cover a bit of the future that we're exploring with server-driven UIs. So who am I? I'm Sudeep. Good morning to everybody in the hall. I am currently a software director at Neo, and I absolutely love talking about onboarding. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to walk everybody through the multiple phases of onboarding at Neo. I've been there for about a bit over 4 years now. The organization itself is about 5 years old. So I've seen a lot of stuff, and I've seen a lot of the evolution, and a lot of my work has been on our onboarding journey for all kinds of products. So phase one, again, company is a small startup. We don't have a lot of people working on this, so I'm going to call it the simple Sam iteration, where Sam's born in 2019. He's very fast, but he's not very flexible. And we'll kind of go through what that looks like. So if you worked in development before, the analogy for Sam is you get all the data and you send it to the server in one big post request. So step one is you collect all of the data on the client side. And then step two, simple enough, you send it to the server and the backend does whatever it needs to get you that product. Again, pretty simple. That's what it's called, simple Sam. Some pros of this approach. Oops. And we'll talk about some cons. So there's no progress saving. In case your app dies, the data dies with it, which is kind of painful because part of getting your credit or deposit accounts is we have to do KYC, which is know your client. And that requires you to do ID verification. And if you don't have your ID card on you or you don't want to do it right now, you come back to the app later and all your data is lost. So not very cool. Things are very slow to change. Because everything's on the front end, the problem is that for any change to the onboarding flow, you have to do an app release, which is very inflexible. And you can only onboard one product at a time because it requires just one large data push to the back end. You have a lot of baked-in assumptions as to what you can support, what you want to support. So you do one product, then you do the other product. And you get a lot of pros, though. So you do get progress tracking because the front end knows how many screens to show you, how much information to collect. And because of that, we can show you, hey, you're 10%, 20%, 30%, et cetera, through the application. Customers absolutely loved it. There's one API contract, right, because you're making one request to the back end. So again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And you have minimal dependencies across teams. You can have your iOS dev work on it separately from your Android dev, separately from your web dev, separately from your backend dev. And all of those people can go in parallel. So that was pretty successful. We ran the system to its limit pretty much with an application count of 2. So back then we did credit and then we added savings. Okay, what was phase 2 for Neo? So phase 2 is what I call grotesque George. And George was born in 2020. And we'll kind of talk about why he's got such a rude name to him. But the way George worked is, so we call that project independent product onboarding. And again, a couple of the big step changes that we did is, one, we introduced the concept of steps. So steps are just independent pages that you go through. It's like when you go to a bank to fill out a form, it's got those little boxes. One's about your name, one's about your address, one's about your tax information. So those are the different steps. And then we introduced the concept of screens. Because each screen collects a different piece of data, the screen itself is implemented on the front end, but it's the back end telling the front end what screen to use next or what kind of data the back end needs. Again, pretty simple iteration on top of what we had on SAM. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons of this approach. So the pros, you can onboard to any product. You can start on your credit product, then you can go on to a savings product, and you can do whatever one you want in whichever order, which was pretty cool because in the previous iteration, you had to get a credit card to even get into the app, which was a huge hurdle. It's like, normally you just give somebody your email and a password and they let you into the app. We said, no, we want your full credit history along with your ID picture to get you into the app. So this was a massive, massive advantage to our users. Because of how the data was presented or stored in the back end and also handled on the front end, the data was constantly synced. So if you started a savings application and you gave it your name, your birth date, and then you backed out of it, then you went to the credit application, your name and your birthday would also be present on the credit application. So that was pretty cool. We saved a lot of people a lot of time giving us information that doesn't change between applications. And because the backend controls what screens are being presented in what order, the backend can just change that, right? And we can do a lot of funnel optimization with it. We can say, oh, hey, maybe we were asking this information too early, the user isn't fully bought in yet. Let's move that to the end of the application. That way, the user is bought in. They're like, okay, this is like a serious thing. Now I'm more inclined to give you that information. And the backend control that, great. This is kind of the first big step change that we did for server-driven UIs. This thing has a lot of cons. And I don't like talking about them because it was quite painful near the end. But you're all here this morning, so yeah, let's talk about them. So first, we had two products, right? Simple Sam gave us the ability to onboard to two different application products. So one was credit, one was savings. Then we partnered with HBC, that's the Hudson's Bay company in Canada, pretty big, and we introduced a new kind of application. So when you go to the store at HBC, associates will onboard you to a credit product, something that I did a lot when I was working as Zellers a long time ago. And then we said, okay, we'll do a normal credit application. What if the HBC users want to go online or get the app and they want to apply for a credit card? Let's make that available to them. Then we said, you know what? Neo's going through this massive growth phase. Let's introduce secured credit for people who are not able to get an unsecured credit line. Then we said, we'll do that for HBC as well. And the complexity kind of grew from there. We're like, okay, this is getting pretty big, pretty chunky. We're not done yet. We said, screw it, we'll add Neo Invest to the system as well. So now we've got 7 different products, and the way it works, it was just a lot of pain to manage that relationship on the back end. And it became very obvious to all of us that this was not going to work. So again, let's talk about the actual cons of this. The synchronization of data across all those different application types, it grew because every time you add a new application, you have to sync the data to all the existing applications. So that complexity just exploded for us at Neo. It became too big to own. What I mean by that is there was one team that understood all the application logic. There was one big backend for this. They ran the backend, and you cannot possibly expect one team to manage all of the onboarding at a rapidly growing startup. And there was no modularity. There was a lot of information that could be shared between the different application types, but all that stuff was stored in one place or with that specific application. So there was no modularity. You couldn't reuse a lot of code. And yeah, that's why the Michael Scott GIF exists there. All right, anyways, we did this. We're up at 7. So George got us to about 7 products. And then we said, let's throw George in the garbage bin and just rethink the way we do onboarding, because it is going to get a lot more complex. All right, now we're at phase 3. Phase 3 is what I call Smart Sally, and Sally was born in 2022, so about 3 years after the company had been founded. So what we call Sally internally is just-in-time onboarding, because the dream I had with my friend and my product manager at that time was we imagined a scenario where we would ask you only enough information to get you a product while you're trying to onboard to it. Our dream scenario was you're at Phil and Seb, who have been a partner with Neo for a very long time. You're in line for a coffee. Maybe the line's a bit longer. It takes you about 5 minutes to get the coffee. We wanted to onboard you to a credit product with minimal information, give you like 10, 50, 100 bucks based on some of our criteria, and you can use your card immediately. So you go into Phil and Seb, you apply for a credit card, you get it immediately, and then you're able to use it to pay for the coffee that you want. So that was our dream scenario with this project. What we did to make that happen. So we centralized all of the data that we could. Things like your name, your date of birth, your address, stuff that is very common to all application types. And then we gave the domain-specific information, we spread that information out to the right teams, and then they had ownership over it. So now you could have those 7, 8 different products being managed by 7, 8 different teams, because this system allows us to build on a foundation. And we said, okay, what we can do, like the last time, is have, if the application has 18 different screens, we cannot do 18 different API contracts, because that's a lot of pain. So then we brought it down to just 2 API contracts. One to say, yeah, you're good to go to onboard for this product, and then one contract to move forward through the application. Thank you for that, robot. All right, so as you can see, the system is kind of evolving. It's pretty sweet from what I experienced with it. No bias. I did work on this project for about 2 years, so it would hurt my ego to admit that this project was a complete failure. Anyway, so the pros of this approach: you've got a unified data store, which is awesome, because now your information being in like 7, 8 different places, it's in one place. And that makes data governance a lot easier, that makes managing the data a lot easier. We were able to distribute the ownership of the centralized information and the product-specific information to a bunch of different teams, and that allowed Neo to scale quite quickly when we were adding new products and new application types. And it was pretty simple. It was essentially a state machine behavior where the backend would say, hey, I need this information next. Okay, I got it. This is the next one I need. And then the front-end logic was very straightforward to just kind of map the request coming from the backend and show the user the right screen. But wasn't all great. There were some cons. So when it comes to the mobile side, we still had to do app releases to change a little bit of copy here and there, to update some screens or to make them look nicer or look better with our design system evolving. It was really hard to separate concerns because we were in this like middle state of what can come from the back end, what should not come from the back end. So a lot of people spend a lot of time having very nuanced conversations about what is the right thing to send from the back end versus to have on the front end. And that slowed us down because we were just blocked by those conversations. And again, there wasn't fully enough modularity in that code because this one big state machine, it was all kept in one big place. We did separate it over the years, but it wasn't quite there yet. Okay, but again, the system worked really well. So kind of reiterate through the phases. So phase 1 with Sam, we got 2 applications. Phase 2 with George, we got up to 7. At the end of phase 3, we had about 18 product applications. And Sally was able to handle that just fine without a problem. But we said, okay, maybe that's not good enough. What do we want to add even more and more stuff to our application count? Because we do want to offer all of the products that people are used to having with their primary bank. That's when we came up with phase 4. So phase 4 is what I call Bulletproof Betty, and she was born this year at Neo. Okay. Internally, we call this project Server-Driven UI, or SDUI. The concept of this approach was to drive the entire UI from the backend. So it's not just little screens, it's like full screens, all of the navigation, keyboard behavior, text validation, formatting, everything should come from the backend as reasonably as possible. And we want to apply this concept to wider than just onboarding. We want to apply it to your accounts page, to your Interact email profile, to your like login screen, everything, because we said this for us is where the future is, and we want to take all of our lessons that we've used from learned from onboarding, we want to apply them to the entire product at Neo. Okay, so again, first let's talk about the cons, because this is a massive direction change for the organization, and if you have experience doing those, you know you gotta stand up to the people who are not fully convinced, and you have to be honest about the cost of making that change. So there's a massive startup cost. You have to figure out, how does this new architecture work? How are you gonna retrain your dev team? How are you going to solve a lot of the problems that you solved earlier on this new paradigm? Again, massive emphasis on developer retraining. They have to change the way they think when it comes to massively server-driven UIs. And the amount of foresight and discipline it requires to make that mindset change, that's not attainable by everybody. It's a very high skill requirement to change the system, change the dev team into something that is this bold as server-driven UI is. But there are some pros. You can entirely skip app releases. If there's a grammatical error, or if you want to change copy, or if you want to change the way something looks or how a button's styled, you can do that over the air. You don't have to do an app release, which again takes a few days to get approved, and then it takes a couple of weeks to fully propagate to your users. It's fully backwards compatible. If I'm on an old version of Neo and Neo wants to push a new change, I can get that if I'm on the app that has it server-driven UI enabled. And it massively increases the impact a single developer can have. Instead of having two separate developers, one working on iOS, one working on Android, we can give that ownership of the entire flow or the screen or whatever that feature may be to one person, for them to control it, for them to figure out how to ship that, how it works, how it looks on both platforms. And at Neo, we're all about ownership. We really value ownership. Okay. Let's dive deep into it. That's why we're all here. So basics of SDUI. What does that look like? So essentially, the best analogy I can think of is, imagine that you're given all the types of Lego bricks in infinite quantity, and then someone tells you how to put them together, and you just do that. That's your life from now on. That is SDUI in a very small nutshell. There's a bit of a recipe to it. How do you actually get there? First of all, you're going to need a lot of Lego bricks. You can't build everything that you can imagine if you're missing half or a third or even 1/10 of the Lego bricks that you actually need. Second thing, you need an instructor. You need someone to tell you how to put those Lego bricks together. You need a common language to speak with that instructor, because there's lots of logic and other structures that can only be achieved or only can be agreed upon if both parties are speaking the same language. But beyond speaking the language, you actually need to understand what's being said. It's not enough to just read the alphabets and say you understand English. You really need to understand English. I think if you've done mobile development or any web development or most development in general, you've already done server-driven UI. The only difference is that your blocks are probably very large, like the size of a car, and I'm talking about blocks like the size of like a nut and a bolt. So let's break the recipe down. What does it mean for Neo? So our Lego bricks is our design system, and it's something that our design team has really matured and worked on over the past 4 years. And what the design system hopes to do is collect all of the components that can ever be used in whatever combination to create full screens and to create full experiences. And without the design system, we would not be able to work on something as complex and as bold as server-driven UI. So that was something that's very critical to the success if you or your organization want to go down this path. This is an example of our design system when it comes to just a simple avatar. An avatar is just going to be a rounded square or a circle, maybe it's got some text, yet we've defined the entire spec in our design system, and it's available to all of our developers. And when we implement our design system in our app, this is what we look to. This is what we look at to make sure that we have all the configuration available and ready for use whenever we need to. Okay, who's our instructor? So we have a cloud component to our mobile app, and that's a relatively new thing, because sure, we have lots of stuff in the cloud and your app is on the back end, but now we're at a point where the app doesn't function or the app is degraded if the backend service goes down. So that's our cloud component. And we are fully powered by Kotlin on that backend. We love Kotlin, so the big things, we use Ktor for our server. We use Kotlin multi-platform to share some code with the backend, the iOS app, and the Android app. And then we leverage Kotlin serialization to speak the same language that the backend and the apps understand. And because Neo has always been such a microservice-heavy company, this new backend service is stood up just like any other backend service, which is great because we've evolved and we've matured our cloud hosting and our backend service structure, the way they communicate, the way they, what we do to like make them highly available. So all of those lessons can be taken and implemented on our new backend service that powers the mobile app. Okay, let's talk about the language. Again, we use Kotlin. The Android folks on our team have used Kotlin since day one. It didn't have to be Kotlin, but we'll get into some reasons why we chose that. And we use Jetpack Compose. For those who are unfamiliar with Jetpack Compose, it's a framework that lets you do declarative UI on the Android side, but it can also be used outside of Android. It's not limited to Android. And it's something that we've leaned into quite heavily since their alpha release back in the fall of 2020, which made me very nervous because I was leading the mobile team and our devs were putting alpha frameworks out into production. So that wasn't very comfortable, but I'm very happy that that particular bet has paid off. And the nice thing about it being a declarative UI is if you're an iOS developer, it kind of fits in the mental model that you would use for Swift UI. Okay, what does our translation look like? Because we have to understand what the backend's saying. So, pretty boring. We use JSON, and that's one of the ways that Kotlin serialization interacts with the other party across the network. That's one of the formats. We picked JSON because it's easier to understand, easier to read if you're a human being. And then what we do on the app side is we've established these one-to-one design system mappings. So whatever the backend says, the app has a mapping for it for what to do with that particular component that's coming from Compose. And the way we ensure that the contracts aren't breaking is that we use a Kotlin multi-platform library that's generated on the server, and then it's sent to it's used by the apps. So then you're always in sync with what the backend is. It's not like JavaScript where you can break anything unknowingly. These things have compile time checks. If something's wrong or something's incompatible, the build breaks, and we know that we have to go fix something. All right, you're like, hey, he's talking a lot, but show me the money. Show me the implementation for this. Cool, so we'll kind of go through some of the code now. So this is an example of a bottom sheet that pops up on one of our screens when you're trying to onboard for an insurance product. This is fully implemented in Kotlin on the back end, and you can kind of see the declarative UI syntax, right? So there's a column that's got a text, a space in the middle, and it's got a button. The button's got a text inside of it and an image, right? So this is all implemented on the back end using Kotlin and Compose. So then what you do is you grab some Kotlin serialization from the pantry, you shake it a bunch, and then this is what comes out to the app. So the same column, the same text, the same space, the button, all of that is communicated over the air with JSON. And that's what the implementation looks like in part, right? So again, pretty straightforward. If I was a human being, I could easily read this. And I could debug and figure out like if something's wrong or what does that actually look like. I can inspect it to quite a high degree. All right, okay, let's do one more example. So I talk about Compose a lot, right? You've heard me say Jetpack Compose probably about 10 times by now. What is that? So the cool thing about Compose is that your components are just made of other components. Everything's just composed all the way down. So in this case, we're like, okay, well, sharing a column from the back end, it sounds pretty complex because it can have anything in there. It can have buttons, text, images. It can have other columns in there. How do you map that complexity on the front end? How do you manage that? And this is a code snippet from our Android app where if it ever gets a column to render, all it does is just calls this function. There's not a whole lot to it because you can compose all the way down. So all those children, all of those little components have their own implementation for what does that look like on the Android app. So you just kind of keep going down that down the levels until you just can't go down anymore, and that's where your concrete implementation lies. So even something as complex as a full app screen is managed relatively easily in terms of complexity because it just sort of recursion inwards, right? And then that's what our basic design system implementation looks like. I know what you're thinking. It's like, my guy, React Native is a thing. Have you heard of it? I actually have. I've spent probably about 3 years working on production React apps used by hundreds of thousands of people. But again, fair question. Everyone asked me this at Neo when we were pitching this idea to our dev team, to our leadership team. Let's take a little detour. Talk about React Native. So first of all, like React Native isn't fully server-driven UI. It doesn't cover all the cases that we wanted to cover. Sure, you can push updates over the air. Sure, you can assemble screens in one point and then have them go down to your iOS, Android, BlackBerry phones and have it rendered there. But it's not SDUI. Because it's not SDUI, it has an even higher startup cost for us. Because again, we're fully native, right? So again, developer retraining becomes a bit of a problem if you're like me and you've ever gone from fully native iOS development to React Native development. It's not the most straightforward thing to transition to. We have to relearn all the lessons that we've learned by building native apps over the past 5 years. We have to do all the re-architecture of what apps should look like at Neo and kind of fight those battles. And it's very risky. I had to do alliteration there. So, and yeah, whenever you're sliding that company into a direction that's that different, it creates a lot of risk, right? And maybe that's not worth it. And React Native is inherently misaligned with Neo's goals. We want the Neo app to be the best banking app you've ever used. And React Native kind of comes with some baggage. There's always a little bit of jank in the views. It's using legacy code from like Java, Objective-C, and when we look at those drawbacks, even like upgrading to new SDKs, to have support for new versions of iOS or Android or new libraries that are available from those ecosystems, you kind of realize that this is likely not the way to build the best banking app in Canada. Could you build a banking app with React Native? Absolutely. Can you build the best one? I don't think so. Now, we've done all this work, right? So far, so good. But it's challenge city when you put, again, the dev team and the organization into a direction that's this different from what we were doing before. Again, our goal is to build the best banking app, which means it needs to have the best user experience. What does that take? So in terms of challenges, we had to figure out what do state changes on the app look like and what does navigation look like on the app. It's not like every time you're entering something into a text field, the app validates on the back end. That's too much, right? So how do you properly handle state changes and screen navigation and going back and coming out of the app and going back into the app? Single screens are relatively easy to build in this paradigm. When you're currying state across different screens, it's not easy. Okay, what does offline and online experience look like? We have to be very mindful about what we or what we take and put into the back end, because some flows are more critical than others. Some flows need to be available more than others, and we have to set up guidelines on what can come from the back end, what should not come from the back end, and that's a pretty important exercise to get right. And that's where the foresight comes in. That's where you need to have exceptional foresight to really build this product to the degree that we want it to be at. What about response time? You've never really had to worry about that when it was all a fully native experience. But now you're getting stuff from the back end. You're getting the layout, the contents of the screen from the back end. So like latency becomes a factor. What about caching? How does caching work when you're trying to give the whole onboarding flow from the back end? Can we prefetch stuff? What does that look like? And then loading states. Do you want loading states on every single screen that you go to? Probably not. That is not what the best banking app in Canada looks like. So those challenges are crazy fun to solve. And the last one is monitoring, right? Usually the way you kind of do it in the current old school way or the fully native way is that you just install Sentry as a dependency, you give it an API key, and you're done. But all those traditional models of monitoring do not work the same when your app is being driven from the server. So we really had to rethink our monitoring strategy, our alerting strategy. How do we get insights into how the app's performing? How do we judge user experience from loading these screens from the back end? And that's a whole chapter on its own. Okay, so we talked about it. What's the product count? I don't know. It's just up and to the right. This thing is still in progress. We've not hit a phase 5 yet, so there's no cap that we've defined already. My hope is we're just going to aim for the moon and see how close we get to it. Okay, now let's talk about the impacts to our team. What we made this change. What does it look like for our team? Why do they bother with it? So first of all, it's extreme agility. The possibility of cutting down an update time or a hotfix time down from like maybe 2 days with App Store approval and whatnot, and then worrying about adoption, we can get that change out in like 30 minutes, right? And that's made our team much more agile and in response to outages or in response to like critical bug fixes that we have to do. It's an absolute force multiplier for every single developer on our team because one dev can control how a full feature is released, when it's released, what does it look like, they can tune the performance of it by themselves. They don't have to wait like 3 weeks to get actionable intel on screen responsiveness or user experience. They can push that out, they can work on it with other folks if they want to, but it's made every single developer at Neo a lot more productive and a lot more valuable. And because of that, it allows our team to scale in a much more predictable way. There are ebbs and flows when it comes to finance and fintech and your bank in terms of what the consumer demands and what they want. And we can't just every time have the team expand and then contract, expand, and contract. That's not how teams work. So by building this SDUI framework and shifting to the paradigm, we made our teams a lot more scalable in response to different demands that come throughout the year. And one thing we really want to do at Neo is we want to stay cutting edge. One thing that these are decisions, let's say, to go native. We made those decisions 5 years ago. Why shouldn't we revisit them every now and then? Why shouldn't we reconsider the options that we picked? Because the options that you have available to you, they change every year, they change every month. If you're in the JavaScript ecosystem, they change every hour. So you have to stay cutting edge, and that's something that like Neo really prouds itself on. It's something that I really believe in, is that to make actual innovation, to do actual innovation, you have to stay cutting edge. And by embracing a paradigm like SDUI, it lets us get there, lets us stay there. And all of that is done so Neo can continue delivering on our promise of building a better and brighter banking future for all Canadians. Thank you. Cool. We've got a few minutes. I think we're going to do a round of quick Q&A.
If anybody has any questions, they can just come right up to this mic over here and ask any questions. Don't be shy.
Yeah, go for it, man.
You can go first. Oh, sure. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It was really exciting to see all your faces. Looks like it's grow a lot from phase 1 all the way to phase 4. I think you mentioned you briefly mentioned difficulty in adopting React Native, and I think all that makes sense. I was just curious about if the Flutter was part of the considerations and how was that conversation go?
Yeah. So Flutter was definitely something that we looked at probably about a year ago. I don't have personal experience with Flutter, but we do look at it, and I know it's actually like much nicer in terms of interaction compared to React Native, but it's the same set of challenges that come with Flutter. Where, let's say, imagine for a second that you can do away with like all the SDK challenges and things like that. There's still a lot of stuff that you have to overcome. Like, will Flutter support something as complex as Neo's app? Will Flutter be able to actually speed up our developers in a shorter time frame? Is Flutter something that we can interop while we are, working on it, and then can interop with our existing app, right? What does that experience look like? Because if you go from one tab to the other tab, and the interaction model is quite different, again, you're not leading to the best banking app in Canada, right? And React Native does interop as well, and to me, it's not quite there. And I think I recommend everybody, I'm like, hey, if you're starting your own company and you want to build an app, definitely just go cross-platform in the beginning, because you're trying to just get product market fit, and you're trying to get users, and you want to get validation on your ideas and your product. But eventually, you have to shift your focus. If you're building an app that is critical as it is to Neo, you really have to reconsider those options. Is that app still servicing you? Is that framework or library or ecosystem, is that still of benefit to you? But yeah, we did consider Flutter, and it was one of those things we said, this is more or less in an abstract sense on par with React Native, and the same set of challenges also apply to that. No worries.
Hi, I'm Sanjay, and I represent CredWise. We are building a challenger banking application to build international credit, agging into credit. And we are going through almost all the process Neo is experiencing within Canada, but on an international level, though.
Right.
And you're using Flutter. That's a great question, so I didn't have to ask that question. And I see that you had to share too much data with other players who you're partnering with. For one, the Hudson Bay Company, in order for them to be able to verify, onboard, and all those things. So how are you streamlining in terms of like technical sense? You have this dream where like someone stands in a line to buy a coffee, and then you're like being able to onboard them in real quick sense. So just managing all this verification, KYC, and AML process with just one backend, or you're building separate backends that's dealt by the partner company, like Tim Hortons or anyone for that sake.
Right. Yeah. So great question. So on Neo side, we do have different backends. Right? So like I said, we have hundreds of different microservices that handle their slice of the business logic, and they've got teams and product experts who work on that. Right. So I'm not going to pretend to be an AML expert because I'm not. That's how you get sued. So we have teams that specifically handle those different use cases, and they've got their segment of their own data. Now, when it comes to sharing information with partners, that is something that kind of happens on the on-demand basis when you're building that partnership, right? Like we may not do our own like full KYC. We may leverage a third party because we're not the KYC experts. We're the banking experts, right? And we'll let the other KYC experts handle that. So when it comes to that, like obviously we want to have that data segmented internally, because sometimes those companies go down, and you can't be like, hey, we sent them the data, they never got back to us. What did we send them? I don't know. So Neo kind of reserves a lot of that information internally, and then whatever we need to share, right? That's done via like very strict protocols and requirements, and over like a long period of time to test to establish that channel will communicate. But primarily, like Neo owns our own data. We don't just hand that off to different companies and say, hey, good luck with this. We value data governance quite heavily, as any fintech should, and because of that, we're able to again have different teams of experts take care of their own data, and they decide what they want to do with it.
Absolutely. And the continuation
Yeah.
of the question is, you kind of like brought down all your APIs to just 2 API. Part of the presentation was that. So is it fair enough for me to assume that any third-party verification request or partner request is also being handled just by 2 API?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. See, the contract, there is one contract, but it was made so flexible. that it could handle all different kinds of inputs, right? But that is still a single API contract, and it just kind of behaves differently every now and then. But the contract itself is solidified, and it's been, again, that phase 3 was my favorite phase because I built it. But yeah, it extended and it worked flawlessly, and then we said, you know what, let's keep innovating. Why stop there?
Thank you, Sudeep.
Yeah, no worries.
Hi. So you mentioned that you rebuilt the app. Is that correct?
I built a significant part of the app. I was not the first person at Neo to work on the app.
Oh no, I mean
Yeah.
like rebuilt it. Or
Yeah, so we're going through a phase currently. Like not all of it's like on phase 4. Like I said, this is something that we started working on this year, and we are slowly putting more and more features of the app into the SUI paradigm and driving them from the back end. We're taking our, because it's a long-term bet, right? And one thing you don't want to do with a long-term bet is like rush into it, because you're going to end up making a lot of mistakes, and then maybe you're in a spot where you can't come back and change things, and that's how you grow to hate something over time. So it's something that we're doing gradually. We're learning as we go. We're trying to figure out, okay, where are the seams kind of coming off of this thing, and then let's spend some time. Let's be mindful about that approach, because more and more people will use it. More and more people will be impacted by it. More and more people will be developing on this thing. So we definitely have some stuff in production currently using STUI, but not the entire app.
so I guess the follow-up question would be, like, how were you able to handle, like, say, adding new features to the old app and then also building out this new framework for the new one?
Right. Yeah. So fantastic question. Whenever you kind of do these shifts, it's like, do you have a zombie app and like a new app? And that's not the case, because our SCUI initiative, it leverages all native code on the app. It interops really, really well, like amazingly well with the existing app, right? So what we can do is go screen by screen, and you wouldn't even know the difference, right? So the same app, the same Android app or iOS app, over time with all kinds of different updates, it'll slowly shift the balance towards away from fully native towards more SDUI-driven components, and all that's done in the exact same app, right? It's not a new app, it's not an old app, because we're still adding more products, we're still adding more capabilities into our existing applications using the native approach that we've really defined over the years. And as we do that, we're also spending some time to cover maybe old features or things that we're like, okay, this would be a good candidate to test out and figure out in a low-risk way. So it's the exact same app.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
My name is Charles. Great presentation. I have 2 questions. The first one has to do with, you talked about sending layout and data from the backend to your mobile apps using JSON. So it just made me wonder, I mean, JSON is a relatively heavy format. And so was that a problem? You know, what kind of things did you do if it presented itself as a problem to sort of, I don't know, maybe make it lighter, maybe make the serialization better? Did you do any diffing on the front end, or was the back end always sending the entire UI, you know, even if just a little, bit of
Right.
UI was changing, that kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then the second question quickly was, I mean, I do respect the value of agility for your team. You talk about a single engineer having so much power to push changes, going from 2 days changes to 30 minutes. But like, how does that impact the user? Are they seeing new UIs every one day? That kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the question of like, JSON is pretty heavy, and I think if you're looking at JSON just the way like humans do, it is quite heavy because there's a lot of repetition, there's lots of words and things like that. But because of that fact, it actually gets compressed pretty easily, right? Over the air, over like HTTP and networking, because it's like if you have the word container in there like 30,000 times, the way that's transmitted, it's not the word container 30,000 times. A lot of compression does take place, right? So initially, just compression is one strategy that you can just get more or less for free. The second thing is really, again, being mindful about what is the stuff that you're sending, right? So maybe I don't want to send the entire app to like down the wire in one go. That would be a lot of data. You're right. But we can send like parts of the app, or what is the user going to see next, right? So we can use some of that intelligence to figure out, okay, you know what, now there, let's say on the profile screen, we can maybe start prefetching some of the usual things that the user goes to next, right, to kind of predict and then make that experience nicer. Another thing we can do is just because we're able to make those changes pretty rapidly, it does not mean we're making wild changes rapidly. That is not conducive to you having the Neo app and to your experience, right? Like if you're going in to look at your credit balance and if every 6 hours it's in a new place, you're just not going to use that app, right? So a lot of our changes are smaller scale, or we're working on like, let's say, one product at a time. And because of that, we're able to cache a lot of that information, right? You can leverage things like e-tags, where you can just say, hey, I have this version of the screen. Is that still good? And the server's like, yeah, no, that's the one. And we can continue using that. So we can save that fetch entirely. For things that are a bit more complex, maybe we do go back and refetch that data. But our bet is that over time, the use of data is going to be quite limited. And then the second question about, okay, you're able to make changes quickly now. What does that mean for the product? The nice thing is those are two different disciplines, right? Just because, again, you're able to do something doesn't mean you are going to do it. So just because a dev is able to push a change does not mean they're going to redo the entire app over the course of a week or 2 weeks or a month. That's where having a very mature product team and a product organization at Neo helps, because we do care about the user experience. I use the Neo app all the time, and I don't want that. I don't want to be changed. I don't want to have to retrain myself or my parents on where does that thing go. So it's more of it's available to us, that option of pushing stuff out quickly, but we also have quite a mature product team, like I said, that will make us be more mindful about those things, right? They're the ones who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to the user experience and what does that look like, and they work with the team. Essentially we are enabling the product and the business teams, but they're the ones who are really fixated on the user experience and trying to minimize the impact on it.
Hi again.
Yeah.
One of the challenges that you mentioned with this big shift over was the onboarding your developer team. I'm very curious on your strategies on how to mitigate that and effectively just train them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so one thing, that's one of the primary reasons why we went with Kotlin and Jetpack Compose, because our mobile team is half Android developers, and they are very familiar with Kotlin and Jetpack Compose. Now, that lets you do two things. One thing is you've got a lot of expertise in-house already that can leverage their knowledge in making these architectural decisions, in making these very, very complex choices that are very impactful. And because they have the expertise, they're going to steer us in the right direction, right? They're not going to let us do something completely crazy because they're not familiar with the framework or the language. So that was one of the great benefits of going with Kotlin. Now, if half your team is already very familiar with that framework, they can coach the other half relatively easy because there's so many experts already in-house. So that's one of the key benefits as well of having half the team already know the thing that you're going to do. And then the second thing that helps with onboarding is our iOS team is switching or shifting more and more to using Swift UI. And as mentioned, Swift UI is also a declarative framework similar to Jetpack Compose. So all the stuff that they're learning, right, with maybe the iOS background and the iOS developer lens, a lot of that is applicable to the SDUI side of things as well. So that's why we made those decisions. And for us, onboarding is relatively easy.
Sure.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll do one more question and then we'll call it. All right. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Hope you have a great rest of your day.